There are no warning signs you would believe. Not at first. The sea pulls back, just slightly, the way it sometimes does before a great storm, the way old fishermen know to fear. The tide retreats farther than any living person has seen it retreat. The harbor floor, slick and dark and strewn with shells and beached fish gasping in the sudden air, lies exposed to the moonlight. Children run out to collect them. They laugh. They don't understand what the ocean is doing. They say the city was the most beautiful thing the world had ever produced. Not beautiful in the way marble temples are beautiful, cold and white and perfectly proportioned, but alive with beauty. Canals running through it like veins, carrying fresh water from the mountains at its center. Concentric rings of land and sea, one within the other, designed by gods or by men who thought they were gods. Towers of red and white and black stone, shot through with metal that caught the sun and held it. A city that seemed to hum with its own intelligence. A city that seemed, somehow, to breathe. Tonight, the lights are still burning in the towers. Tonight, there are still people in the streets, children in the harbor, priests in the temples chanting the old prayers to the old gods. Tonight, the world still contains this city. It will not contain it by morning. The first tremor comes just before midnight. It is not the worst. The earth has shaken before. The old buildings have survived worse. But something is different this time, something the animals know before the people do. Dogs in every district begin to howl simultaneously. Birds that should be sleeping burst from their roosts in the thousands, a dark cloud of wings against the stars. Horses break their tethers and run for higher ground, though there is no higher ground to reach, not for everyone. The priests say, the gods are angry. They have been saying this for years. This time, the gods are listening. Then the second tremor. And the third. And then the ocean comes back. The waters take it all. The towers first, shearing away from their bases, tilting, falling. Then the temples, the markets, the canals, the bridges of red and white stone. The concentric rings of the city, one by one, swallowed. The fires go out. The lights go out. The prayers go out, midward, unfinished. And then there is only the sea. Flat. Silent. Indifferent. As if the city had never been. What you just witnessed is the end of Atlantis. At least, the end that one man described, 2,500 years ago, in a small room in Athens, by lamplight writing words that the world would spend the next 2 millennia arguing about. His name was Plato, and the story he told might be the greatest mystery in the history of the human mind. The year is approximately 360 BCE. Athens, a city at the height of its intellectual power, still recovering from the devastation of its war with Sparta, still wrestling with questions that would define Western civilization for the next 2,000 years. Who should rule? What is justice? What does it mean to live a good life? And, perhaps the most dangerous question of all, what happens to civilizations that lose their way? Into this world comes Plato, already one of the most celebrated thinkers in the ancient world, a student of Socrates and teacher of Aristotle. He is now an old man, perhaps in his late 60s, and he is writing the last great works of his career. Dialogues, he calls them. Philosophical conversations between characters, some historical, some invented, all serving the purpose of exploring ideas too large and too important to be expressed in a simple essay. He writes 2 dialogues in particular that concern us here. The Timaeus and the Critias. In the Timaeus, a character named Critias, supposedly based on a real Athenian statesman, tells a remarkable story. He claims to have heard it from his grandfather, who heard it from the Athenian lawgiver Solon, who heard it from the Egyptian priests of Sais, who had preserved it in their records for 9,000 years. A story of a great civilization that existed long before Athens. A story of a naval empire that once dominated the world. A story of a people so proud, so powerful, so certain of their own greatness, that the gods destroyed them for it. The civilization was called Atlantis. And according to Critias, according to Plato, it was not a myth. It was not a metaphor. It was, he insists repeatedly, and with unusual emphasis for a philosopher who is comfortable with allegory, a true story. In the Critias dialogue, Plato goes further, much further, describing Atlantis in a level of detail that is almost architectural in its precision. He tells us the island was larger than Libya and Asia combined, that it lay beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, in the Atlantic Ocean, that it was ruled by the descendants of the god Poseidon and a mortal woman named Cleito, whose union produced 10 kings who divided the island empire between them. He describes the capital city with the care of a surveyor. Concentric rings of alternating land and sea, 3 rings of water, 2 of land, surrounding a central island where the royal palace stood. The outermost ring of water was 3 stades wide. The middle ring was 2. The innermost ring was 1. He gives us the measurements of the bridges, the width of the canals, the placement of the walls. He tells us the walls were covered in a metal called orichalcum, more precious than anything except gold, that shone red in the light. He tells us there were hot springs and cold springs, public baths, a hippodrome, sacred groves, temples roofed with ivory. And then Plato tells us what went wrong. The Atlanteans were, in the beginning, virtuous. They were wise and temperate and just. They ruled their empire with restraint and wisdom. But over generations, slowly, inevitably, the divine nature they had inherited from Poseidon was diluted by their mortal blood. The human part of them grew stronger. And the human part wanted more. They became greedy. They became corrupt. They began to pursue wealth and power above all else. They sent armies out to conquer the world, pushing into the Mediterranean, threatening Egypt, threatening Athens itself. And Athens, small, democratic, virtuous Athens, held them off. Alone, if Plato's Critias is to be believed. A stand that saved civilization. Then came the judgment of the gods. Zeus, looking down at the degraded Atlanteans, called a council of the divine. He prepared to speak, to pronounce their doom. And here, the Critias dialogue ends. Abruptly. Mid-sentence. As if Plato simply stopped writing. We do not know why. Some scholars believe Plato died before completing the work. Others have suggested he lost interest, or deliberately left it unfinished as a literary device. And others, a significant minority still debated today, have suggested something more unsettling, that what Plato wrote in the Critias is not, in fact, the beginning of an allegory at all, but the fragment of something much older. A story preserved in the memory of priests in a city older than Athens. A story of something real. But before we follow that thread, before we descend into the deep water where the real questions live, we need to understand what Plato was trying to do. Because the answer to that question shapes everything else that follows. Was Atlantis a myth? Was it a moral allegory? Or was it a memory? These 3 possibilities are not as mutually exclusive as they might first appear. The ancient Greeks were not, in any simple sense, people who distinguished between myth and history the way we do. Their myths were not merely stories. They were vessels for truth. Truths about human nature, about the relationship between mortals and gods, about the inevitable arc of civilization from virtue to corruption and back again. Plato himself was deeply suspicious of unexamined stories. In the Republic, he famously proposed censoring the poets, whose myths he believed were morally corrupting. He was a philosopher, not a poet. He dealt in argument, not narrative. So when he chose to embed his most complex political ideas in a narrative, in a story, what was he doing? Most classical scholars today believe that Atlantis was, at its core, an invention, a deliberately constructed thought experiment. Plato needed a foil for his ideal state. He needed a civilization that had everything, wealth, power, military might, advanced technology, and had still failed. And so he invented one. Or, more precisely, he elaborated on an existing tradition, a folk memory perhaps, and shaped it into a perfect philosophical object, a civilization destroyed by its own success. This interpretation is compelling. Plato was, after all, living in the shadow of Athens' own catastrophic failure. The Peloponnesian War had ended less than 40 years before he began writing. Athens, once the most powerful city in the Greek world, had been brought to its knees by its own overreach, its own hubris. A philosopher reflecting on that collapse, trying to understand why great civilizations fail, might very naturally construct the story of Atlantis, an ancient, exaggerated mirror of Athens' own experience. And yet, the details are too specific, the measurements too precise, the story too insistently framed as true. Plato goes out of his way, in the Timaeus, to have Socrates express explicit delight that the story of Atlantis is a real history rather than an invented myth. The greatest advantage of it, Socrates says, is that it's not a fiction but genuine history. Why would Plato put these words in Socrates' mouth, his most trusted literary mouthpiece, if the intention was allegory? Why invent the elaborate chain of transmission? The Egyptian priests, the records 9,000 years old, Solon's visit, the family memory passed down through generations? If Atlantis were simply a thought experiment, the chain of transmission serves no purpose. It only makes sense if Plato wanted the reader to believe, at least provisionally, that the story had a real source. And here is where the story becomes something more than a philosophical puzzle. Because there is a third possibility, one that neither the pure allegorists nor the pure literalists have been entirely comfortable with. What if Plato was doing both? What if he took a real cultural memory, fragmentary, imprecise, distorted by 9,000 years of oral transmission, and shaped it into a moral argument? What if Atlantis is not a lie, and not a literal truth, but something more complicated and more interesting than either? A memory of something real, retold until it became a myth, then retold again by a philosopher until it became a warning. This is the question that has driven human beings for 2,000 years. Across every century, in every culture that encountered Plato's text, the same question surfaces: is there something real underneath the story? And the terrifying answer, the answer that keeps this mystery alive, is that we don't know. We genuinely, honestly, with all our modern scientific tools and satellite imaging and deep-sea exploration technology, do not know. Which means we must look for it. In the summer of 1967, a Greek archaeologist named Spiridon Marinatos was digging through layers of volcanic ash on the island of Santorini, known in antiquity as Thera, when he found something that changed the way the world thought about the Bronze Age. And about Atlantis. He found a city. Not fragments of a city. Not the scattered ruins that archaeology so often produces, a foundation here, a potsherd there. He found a complete urban settlement, preserved beneath 30 meters of volcanic pumice with extraordinary completeness. Streets. Buildings. Frescoes still vivid with color after more than 3,000 years. Jars still containing food. Furniture. Tools. The organized remnants of a sophisticated civilization that had been simply erased by a volcanic eruption so powerful that modern geologists estimate it was among the largest in recorded geological history. Perhaps 4 times more powerful than the 1883 Krakatoa eruption that sent shockwaves around the world. The city is called Akrotiri, and the civilization that built it is called Minoan, after the mythological king Minos of Crete. The Minoans were the first great civilization of the Aegean world, predating classical Greece by more than 1,000 years. They built elaborate palace complexes, developed early writing systems, traded across the Mediterranean, and, based on the evidence at Akrotiri, maintained sophisticated urban centers on multiple islands. And then, somewhere between 1627 and 1600 BCE, the volcano beneath Santorini exploded. The eruption collapsed the central part of the island into the sea, creating the dramatic caldera we see today, a vast circular bay where a mountain once stood. Massive tsunamis radiated outward across the Aegean and eastern Mediterranean. The Minoan civilization, centered on the nearby island of Crete, was severely disrupted. Its palace centers destroyed, its trade networks shattered, its cultural coherence fractured. Within a century, the Minoans were gone, replaced by the early Greeks. The connection to Atlantis is, on the surface, compelling. Here is a sophisticated island civilization, more advanced than anything around it, destroyed catastrophically and within living memory, swallowed, at least in part, by the sea. Here is a story that could survive in fragmented cultural memory, passed down through generations of Egyptians and Greeks, becoming more distorted with each retelling, until by the time it reached Solon's ears in Egypt it had been inflated from a Bronze Age catastrophe to a 9,000-year-old divine apocalypse. The theory has serious, credentialed support. The archaeologist J.V. Luce, the oceanographer James Mavor, and many others have argued that the Minoan eruption is the most plausible real-world event behind the Atlantis story. The geography fits, roughly. The civilization fits, roughly. The destruction by sea fits, roughly. But the problems are significant. Plato says Atlantis was beyond the Pillars of Hercules, outside the Mediterranean entirely. Santorini is inside the Mediterranean, well within the Pillars. Plato says the island was larger than Libya and Asia combined. Santorini is a small Aegean island, perhaps 15 kilometers across, even before the eruption. Plato says the catastrophe occurred 9,000 years before his time, around 9,600 BCE. The Minoan eruption occurred around 1600 BCE, a full 8,000 years after Plato's date. 9,000 years before Plato. Or 900. This is the escape hatch the Minoan theorists use. A factor of 10 error, either deliberate or accidental, applied consistently to every number in the transmission. If Plato's 9,000 years is actually 900, if his dimensions are off by a factor of 10, then the numbers come much closer to the Minoan reality. It's a possibility. It's also, some would argue, the kind of adjustment you make when you want a theory to work. The Minoan hypothesis remains the most academically respectable of all the Atlantis theories. But respectability is not the same as certainty. And the ocean still holds its secrets. The name Atlantis contains a name, Atlas. The titan who holds up the sky. The god whose name was also given to the great ocean that separates the old world from the new. The Atlantic Ocean. Plato says this directly. In his account, the ocean was named after the island empire that once dominated it. Before Atlantis sank, its influence extended across the sea in both directions. For most of the last 2 millennia, the Atlantic interpretation of Atlantis has been the popular one. The one that captured imaginations. The one that, in the 19th century, launched the modern era of Atlantis obsession. The man most responsible for this was not a scientist. He was an American politician. His name was Ignatius Donnelly, and in 1882 he published a book called Atlantis, The Antediluvian World, which would become one of the best-selling non-fiction books of the 19th century, and would essentially create the template for every popular Atlantis theory that followed. Donnelly's argument was sweeping, ambitious, and profoundly influential. He surveyed the cultural similarities between ancient civilizations on either side of the Atlantic, pyramid building in Egypt and Mesoamerica, similar flood myths in dozens of cultures, cognate words between ancient languages separated by an ocean, similar astronomical knowledge, similar agricultural practices, and concluded that all of these similarities pointed to a single source. A mid-Atlantic civilization that had spread its influence in both directions before its catastrophic end. Atlantis was not just a lost city, in Donnelly's view. It was the original civilization, the mother of all others. His ideas were immediately and enthusiastically embraced by the reading public, and almost as immediately rejected by the scientific establishment. And the scientific establishment, in this case, had the better arguments. The cultural similarities Donnelly identified are largely superficial. Two cultures both building pyramids tells us less than he thought, because pyramids are a logical structural solution to the problem of building very tall things out of stone. The flood myths are near universal because catastrophic floods are near universal human experiences. The linguistic similarities he proposed do not hold up to modern comparative linguistics. And then there is the geology. The Atlantic Ocean floor has been mapped with extraordinary precision by modern oceanography. We know what is down there. We have sonar images, deep-sea drilling cores, photographic surveys. And what is down there is not a sunken continent. It is the mid-Atlantic ridge, a vast underwater mountain range created by the spreading of tectonic plates, active volcanically, ancient beyond any human civilization. There is no place in the Atlantic where a continent-sized landmass could have existed and then sunk within the last 12,000 years. The geology does not permit it. Continental crust does not simply sink into oceanic crust on human historical timescales. And yet, the ocean is still the place Plato put it. And the ocean does not give up all its secrets to satellite imaging and sonar. In 2001, a Canadian exploration team using sonar discovered a series of anomalous geometric formations off the coast of Cuba, at a depth of 700 meters, regular stone structures arranged in what appeared to be a grid. Platforms. Pyramids, some reports suggested. The discovery generated extraordinary excitement, briefly. Then the follow-up investigation concluded that the formations were most likely natural geological features, volcanic rock fractured along regular lines. Most likely. The Cuban anomaly was forgotten almost as quickly as it was discovered. But the question it asked does not go away. The Atlantic Ocean covers 106 million square kilometers. Its average depth is 3,300 meters. We have mapped it in broad strokes, but the detail, the specific, site-by-site detail, is still largely unknown. We have better maps of Mars than we do of the ocean floor. Something is down there. We don't know what. In 1929, in the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul, a Turkish naval officer named Halil Edem discovered a map. It had been drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis, who noted in his annotations that the map was based on older sources, including, he claimed, sources from antiquity. The Piri Reis map shows the Atlantic Ocean. It shows the western coast of Africa. It shows the eastern coast of South America, with reasonable accuracy. And then, at the bottom, it shows something that should not be there. A large landmass running across the southern portion of the map, contiguous with the southern tip of South America, depicted with what appears to be mountain ranges and river systems. This is a map of a coastline that, under the ice of Antarctica, the modern world would not document until 1949. The Piri Reis map became, in the 1960s, the centerpiece of an extraordinary theory proposed by Charles Hapgood, a professor of history at Keene State College in New Hampshire. Hapgood argued that the map's accurate depiction of Antarctica's coastline, under ice that has been there for at least 12,000 years, could only be explained if it had been based on surveys made before the ice arrived. Surveys made by a civilization advanced enough to conduct accurate cartography across multiple continents. A pre-ice age civilization. Atlantis. Hapgood proposed a mechanism for the end of this civilization, crustal displacement. The entire outer shell of the Earth, he argued, could shift periodically relative to the interior, moving geographical regions toward the poles, instantly glaciating previously temperate lands. Antarctica, once located in a more temperate zone, could have been a habitable continent, home to an advanced civilization, before crustal displacement moved it to its current position at the South Pole. Albert Einstein wrote the foreword to Hapgood's book. Let that sink in for a moment. Einstein was enthusiastic about the theory, but careful to note it required more evidence. He died before Hapgood could provide it. And the geological consensus, as it developed through the latter half of the 20th century, rejected crustal displacement as a mechanism. It would require forces so enormous as to be physically impossible within any remotely plausible geological framework. But the Piri Reis map remains a puzzle. Its depiction of the southern continent, whether it is Antarctica or simply a speculative landmass that ancient cartographers placed there on theoretical grounds, is still debated. Professional cartographers note that the resemblances to the subglacial Antarctic coastline, when examined carefully, are less precise than the enthusiasts claim. The similarities require careful selective reading of an admittedly ambiguous old map. And yet the map exists. The debate exists. And Antarctica itself has not finished yielding its secrets. In recent years, radar imaging has revealed previously unknown geological features beneath the ice, mountain ranges, lake systems, and more than one area of anomalous topography that current science has not fully explained. The ice is melting, slowly, irresistibly, under the influence of a warming climate. Whatever lies beneath it is being revealed, incrementally, layer by layer. What we will find there, no one yet knows. The Rickhat structure is one of the most striking geological formations on Earth. It was first photographed from space in the 1960s, and for decades, geologists assumed it was an impact crater, the scar left by a meteorite. It is perfectly circular. It is enormous. It has the visual signature of a violent origin. But subsequent geological investigation revealed that it is not an impact crater. It is, instead, a deeply eroded geological dome, ancient rock layers exposed by millions of years of erosion, forming concentric rings as harder and softer rock weathered at different rates. It is entirely natural. It is entirely geological. There is no mystery about what it is. And yet, in 2018, a series of videos began circulating online making a detailed argument that the Rickhat structure was, in fact, the site of Atlantis. The argument went like this. The structure is located near the ancient Atlantic coastline of North Africa, within what Plato described as the region beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The concentric ring structure matches Plato's description. The structure is elevated. It could have been coastal before the Sahara was a desert. And the Sahara was not always a desert. Geological evidence confirms that 12,000 years ago, during what climatologists call the African humid period, the Sahara was a savanna, green, watered, supporting large human populations. The videos were watched tens of millions of times. The Rickhat structure became, briefly, the most famous rock formation in the world. Geologists were, collectively, unimpressed. The structural similarities are visual coincidences. The Rickhat rings are geological layers, not engineered canals, and they bear no relationship to Plato's carefully specified measurements. The elevated position of the structure means it was never coastal. It sits far inland, even accounting for ancient sea level changes. And while the African humid period is real, the timescales and geographies do not match Plato's account in any precise way. But the Rickhat theory did something useful. It reminded people that the Sahara is a relatively recent phenomenon. That the world 12,000 years ago looked very different from the world we inhabit. That sea levels were different, climates were different, coastlines were different. The world of 9,600 BCE, the date Plato gives for Atlantis, was not our world. This is the most important thing the Rickhat debate gave us. A reminder that our intuitions about where to look are constrained by the modern world. The landscape of human prehistory is largely lost to us, covered by rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age, buried under desert sand, hidden beneath modern cities, or simply eroded out of existence by 12,000 years of time. We are looking for Atlantis in a world that has been substantially rearranged since it might have existed. Which raises the question, what are we actually looking for? Every century since Plato wrote the Timaeus, human beings have searched for Atlantis. They have searched in the Atlantic, in the Mediterranean, in the Caribbean, in Antarctica, in Bolivia, in Ireland, in Spain, in Cyprus, in the Black Sea. They have used myth analysis and geological surveys and satellite imagery and deep-sea submersibles. They have found compelling hints and frustrating dead ends. They have not found Atlantis. What does this persistent failure tell us? Perhaps nothing. Perhaps it simply confirms what most classical scholars have believed all along, that Atlantis was never there to find. That Plato invented it. That 2,000 years of searching have been a magnificent wild goose chase, inspiring some extraordinary science and archaeology along the way, but ultimately pointing nowhere. Or perhaps it tells us something about the nature of what is lost. We know, with geological certainty, that the end of the last ice age, roughly between 12,000 and 7,000 years ago, saw a rise in global sea levels of approximately 120 meters. This was not a smooth, gradual process. It occurred in pulses, some of them rapid enough to be catastrophic in human terms. Geologists have identified what they call meltwater pulses, sudden injections of ice meltwater into the oceans that could raise sea levels by several meters within centuries, or even decades. During this period, as the great ice sheets of the Ice Age retreated, vast areas of continental shelf were flooded. The North Sea, now a shallow sea between Britain and continental Europe, was dry land for thousands of years. The Persian Gulf was a river valley. The Black Sea may have been a freshwater lake before the Mediterranean broke through the Bosphorus. The Sunda Shelf of Southeast Asia, now the shallow sea between the Indonesian islands, was once a subcontinent, perhaps home to millions of people. These are not speculations. These are established geological facts. Somewhere in that process of flooding, somewhere in the 12,000 years of rising oceans, human civilizations were lost. We know this. We have found traces of them. Submerged settlements have been found off the coasts of India, Japan, Britain, Turkey, and elsewhere. At the site known as Dvarka, in the Gulf of Khumbat off the coast of western India, sonar has revealed what appears to be an urban settlement at a depth of 40 meters, possibly dating to the Neolithic period, possibly more than 9,000 years old. These are real findings, examined by real scientists, debated in real academic journals. None of them are Atlantis, but all of them are Atlantis, because what they demonstrate, collectively, is that the deep past is not empty, that before the civilizations we know, before Mesopotamia and Egypt and the Indus Valley, there were people, there were communities, there were cultures that left traces we are only beginning to find. Some of those cultures were certainly lost to the sea. So the question becomes, is Atlantis a specific lost place, Santorini, or a mid-Atlantic continent, or the Rickhat structure, or is it the name we have given to the entire lost world of human prehistory? Is it one city, one catastrophe, one moment? Or is it all the cities and all the catastrophes and all the moments we have not yet found? And if it is the latter, if Atlantis is, in the end, the name for everything we have forgotten, then perhaps Plato was not lying. Perhaps he was not inventing. Perhaps he was, in the most profound sense, telling the truth. The truth that the world forgets. The truth that civilizations end. The truth that the sea takes back what it once gave. The search for Atlantis has never been more technically sophisticated, and it has never been less certain of its target. Modern ocean floor mapping has advanced to the point where we can produce three-dimensional topographic models of the deep ocean floor at resolutions fine enough to identify unusual formations. Projects like the JEBCO Mapping Initiative, which aims to map the entire ocean floor by 2030, are systematically surveying regions that have never been examined in detail. The data produced by these surveys is publicly available, and it is being combed by researchers, both professional oceanographers and amateur enthusiasts, looking for anomalies. The anomalies are found, occasionally, and each one generates a cycle of excitement, investigation, and usually, disappointment. A suspiciously regular pattern of ridges turns out to be a natural geological feature. A series of circular formations turns out to be the result of gas seeping from the ocean floor, creating characteristic ring-shaped deposits. A flat, elevated plateau at unexpected depth turns out to be ancient volcanic rock, placed long before any human civilization. And yet the search does not stop. In 2011, a team of Spanish and American researchers announced evidence of a possible Atlantis candidate near the Spanish coast, buried under marshland in the Dinana National Park. Ground-penetrating radar had revealed what appeared to be the concentric ring structure Plato described, buried under mud that had accumulated over millennia. The team was careful in its claims. They spoke of a possible candidate, and further investigation required. The world's media was less careful. Atlantis found, ran the headlines. The researchers had to spend considerable energy walking the claims back. Subsequent investigation of the Dinana site has been complicated by the protected status of the wetlands, which limits what kind of excavation is permissible. The debate about what lies under the mud continues, quietly, in academic journals. No definitive conclusion has been reached. This pattern of discovery, excitement, doubt, and unresolved investigation repeats itself with remarkable consistency in the history of Atlantis research. It suggests either that the evidence for Atlantis is genuinely ambiguous, or that the human desire to find Atlantis is powerful enough to see patterns in noise. Possibly both. Whatever Atlantis is or was, its legend has generated one of the most productive intellectual traditions in Western history. The Atlantis story gave Francis Bacon the framework for his utopian vision in New Atlantis, published in 1627, which described an ideal society dedicated to scientific knowledge and human flourishing, and which directly influenced the founding of the Royal Society, the first great institution of modern science. The idea of a lost civilization more advanced than the present one gave rise to a tradition of speculative archaeology that, whatever its excesses, has pushed real archaeologists to take seriously the possibility that the deep past is more complex than the conventional timeline suggests. The Atlantis myth became, in the 19th century, one of the organizing metaphors for European colonialism, the idea that indigenous cultures around the world were not the products of their own independent development but were remnants of a lost superior civilization. This was a pernicious idea, used to justify the dismissal and destruction of real human achievement. It is important to acknowledge this. The Atlantis myth has been used for harm. It has also been used for beauty. The literature and art and music that the myth has inspired, from Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues to Tolkien's Akalabeth to the children arriving at the coast of what might be Narnia, stretches across every medium and every century of Western culture. The image of a great civilization lost to the sea is one of the most powerful images in the human imagination. It resonates because it speaks to something deep in the experience of being mortal. Everything passes. Everything is lost. What we build will be covered by water, or sand, or time. And perhaps that is the most honest thing we can say about Atlantis. Not that it exists. Not that it doesn't. But that it has always served as a mirror. A civilization at the height of its power looks at Atlantis and sees a warning. A civilization in decline looks at Atlantis and sees a golden age. A civilization reaching outward, toward space, toward the ocean floor, toward the edges of what is known, looks at Atlantis and sees a challenge. Somewhere, something is lost. Somewhere, something waits to be found. The myth survives because the need it serves is universal and eternal. We have always known that we forget. We have always known that the world is older than our memory of it. We have always suspected that the past holds things we cannot imagine, because they happened before anyone was left to imagine them. Atlantis is the name of that suspicion. The ocean covers 71% of the Earth's surface. We have mapped, in any meaningful detail, less than 20% of the ocean floor. What lies in the remaining 80%? What structures, what formations, what remnants we do not know. There are places in the ocean where the water is 4 kilometers deep. 8 kilometers. 11. Places where the pressure is so extreme that the materials we build our best submarines from are slowly, inevitably crushed. Places we cannot go. Not yet. In 9600 BCE, if Plato's date is to be taken seriously, the world was at the end of the last ice age. Sea levels were rising rapidly. Coastal regions that had been inhabited for thousands of years were being flooded. Human beings living on those coasts were watching their world disappear, Not overnight, in most places, but over decades and centuries. They were moving inland. They were building new settlements. And they were, perhaps, telling their children about the places they had come from. The harbors, the buildings, the cities, the land that the sea had taken. Those stories, told to children who told them to their children, across 100 generations. What do they sound like, by the end? How much detail survives? How much is distorted? How much becomes, over the centuries, a myth? We do not know if Atlantis was real. We cannot know, not with the evidence currently available to us. Perhaps we will never know, because the evidence may be gone, dissolved by 12,000 years of ocean chemistry, buried under sediment too deep to reach, or simply lost in the noise of the planet's endless geological self-revision. But we know that something was real. We know that people lived on coastlines that no longer exist. We know that the sea rose and did not stop rising until it had reshaped the world. We know that the great catastrophes of the end of the Ice Age were experienced by human beings, our ancestors, as exactly that, catastrophes, the end of their world. And we know that they told their children, and those children told their children, and the story passed, from voice to voice, from language to language, from culture to culture, for 9,000 years before it reached a philosopher in Athens who wrote it down and gave it a name. Somewhere below us, in the dark, in the cold, under the impossible pressure of all that water and all that time, something waits. We don't know what it is. We don't know if it is anything at all. We only know that the sea does not give back what it takes, and that we keep looking anyway, because that is what human beings do. We remember. We search. We tell the story. Even when we cannot prove the story is true. Especially then.